Welcome to Unlapped. Nate and I are here in Singapore anticipating another fantastic race after the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. You'll notice once again, Katie George is not with us. Don't worry, Katie fans, she will be back. But for this preview to the Singapore Grand Prix, it's just going to be Nate and I. So remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. If you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's get into this. Another epic race weekend in Baku, where Oscar Piastri secured his second win of the season, along with some late race drama between Ferrari and Red Bull. So, Nate, let's reflect on the major takeaways here. McLaren, it was both a brilliant weekend, but also a little bit of what could have been with Lando Norris.
It was, wasn't it? And I think in hindsight, when you look at it, you can kind of understand why McLaren have been a bit reluctant to immediately enforce some kind of team order and say to Piastri before Monza, hey, you're now second fiddle to Norris, because exactly that kind of weekend could have happened. You know, it's no guarantee Norris is going to have clean weekends all the way through. And as I think McLaren have known for a long time, and I think as we're all beginning to realize, Piastri's just a complete superstar, isn't he? I mean, the way he took that win was unbelievable. And I actually thought Norris, from where he started, what he did, and the fact, the way he helped Piastri, was really, really impressive as well. So given how it looked after qualifying, with Norris so far down, you thought maybe Verstappen's going to take some points back from him. It went as well as it could have done potentially. And the fact that they came out of that weekend with a win, with their driver, the driver harmony is still fine there. Every one of these weekends, it's almost like, are they going to trip over themselves? Is something going to happen where suddenly, we've seen it at teams before, haven't we? But yeah, things just keep going well. So really impressive weekend from them. And it's just crazy, isn't it, how McLaren has become the benchmark team so quickly. But yeah, to see Piastri stealing that move on Charles Leclerc, I mean, you were there. I was watching on TV, and I was making a lot of noise. My neighbors must have wondered what I was watching. One of the best moves I've seen in a long time, but I imagine in the media center as well, it was a similar reaction seeing that.
Yeah, it's actually fairly quiet in the media center in Baku. Not many journalists make
That's
the
true,
trip.
actually. It's that little weird conference center, isn't it? That's like kind of really quiet and quite empty. Not the
It is.
best one for it.
Yeah, part of one of the hotels at either end of the paddock. But even so, there was, as much atmosphere as you get in Baku when Piastri pulled that pass. And then, of course, all those laps afterwards, I think a lot of focus was on that overtake. But the fact that he was able to absorb the pressure after that was really quite special. I felt with Norris, the race went absolutely as well as it could have gone. But after the race, the one thing that he just kept talking about is how unfair that yellow flag was in qualifying. That
Yeah.
was the reason that he was down 15th on the grid and just couldn't quite put that lap together at the end, which would have certainly got him into Q2, and then he would have been in Q3. And then it's that what might have been, because of course we saw Piastri go and win. Well, if Lando had been up there, I'm sure he could have, or at least would have felt like he could have fought for that victory as well. But interesting you pick up the team orders, because one of the other takeaway quotes I kind of stuck in my head afterwards was Christian Horner talking about how much of a
Yeah.
problem it is for McLaren to have these two drivers in this position, and these team orders that are still a little bit unclear. They're a little bit opaque in what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. I thought it was interesting because Horner all of a sudden was picking up on that again on a race weekend where, as you say, McLaren's team orders, there was only one. It went to Norris to hold up Perez so they would help Piastri with his strategy. Worked perfectly, like no real kind of back talk, no real questioning. At the end of the race, Andrea Stella praised Norris, and Norris kind of even said to himself, he felt like he had a part in the victory. But even so, Horner felt the need to kind of point at the potential of what could go wrong with team orders at McLaren, having these two drivers at the front. But I think we should focus on perhaps what he's trying to protect there, Christian Horner, and the difficulties that Red Bull faced yet again. Weirdly, for the first time this year almost, or certainly for the first time since around China time, Sergio Perez didn't have many issues, but Max Verstappen did.
Yeah, and that seems to be becoming a bigger story, doesn't it? Because we've seen Max struggling a little bit more. I mean, I remember from Hungary when he had that radio where that race where he basically spent the entire race on the radio having a slagging off match with Giampiero Lambiase, didn't he? Basically, the two of them just arguing the whole way through. And Max has been getting more and more uncomfortable. And Perez made a point, didn't he, after Monza? He said, all the problems I've had with the car, we're now seeing. Max has just been able to drive around them, and I think Red Bull have hinted that that's maybe masked some of the issues, or maybe they've made some missteps in development that Max being so good has almost kind of hidden from them. So yeah, I think it is fascinating that's happening. And you've got to give Red Bull some credit, and I know that Perez didn't finish the race, but one of the reasons they said they wanted to keep him in was because they pointed to some of these circuits coming up and they said strong ones coming up. And I think Baku and Singapore were the two they looked at. And certainly, obviously, on paper, it will never be that Perez scored points, but it was a really strong performance. I think that was the Perez a lot of us can remember from his first season when he showed glimpses of having race winning potential. So yeah, I think that's an interesting dynamic. But I think just to go back to that Christian Horner quote, it is fascinating, isn't it? Because whenever he does stuff like that, I think he's deflecting pressure away. We saw lots of that from him and Toto Wolff in 21, and now suddenly he's wading in on McLaren's team orders. If you're Zach Brown, you've got to be looking at that and saying, well, look, we're getting to him. He's worried, he's talking about us to the media. Obviously, Christian Horner knows about having two very, teammates fighting for a championship. But yeah, that was my first takeaway was just, this fascinating part of this season is the team chasing. There's really, and what did I say, the team chasing, the team now ahead in the Constructors' Championship, I think don't feel the pressure the same way Red Bull does, because a few months ago, all of us, and I think Red Bull included, thought, okay, well, probably going to win the championship, aren't they? Quite comfortably. Now, not only are they behind in the Constructors' Championship, the Drivers' Championship is looking very, very vulnerable as well. So yeah, you're starting to see that a lot. And I think that this weekend is going to be so telling, because if Verstappen is still off the pace to Perez, then that's a trend, isn't it? And that's something suddenly where not just, okay, our car's a mess as well, but it's also we've got the car to a point where our superstar three-time world champion driver, he's now the one feeling the pain of it, and then you're relying on Perez to kind of do the best he can with the car. So yeah, really, it's mind-boggling to see it happening, because if you're Christian Horner, you must be looking at this and just being like, this is just getting worse every race. You'd think that they'd hit a point and be like, okay, we've hit the bottom of this now, but it doesn't seem like they have, does it? At this point, you just wonder. I'm not sure Max is going to have weekends like that every weekend, but certainly this weekend, you think about how they did here last year, this could be another painful one. Just looking at as a small sample size.
Yeah, we've seen this with a number of teams at the front of the grid, and it happens throughout the grid, but you don't notice so much further back, where teams just get a little bit lost with the development. So they'll bring an upgrade and it doesn't really do what the team was hoping. Or if it does, it unbalances the car. So the drivers are no longer as confident as they were. And that's essentially what has happened to Red Bull. And it was just the case that because of Checo Perez's level versus Max's level, Checo got uncomfortable with it much earlier than Max did. And now Max is uncomfortable too. Max actually thinks they made progress in Azerbaijan, just with the changes to the floor they made. He reckons they've actually made a step forward, and it was the setup. So he had a different setup to Checo, very normal for two drivers. Certainly those two were quite different driving styles, demands from the car to go in different directions. And Max was looking at it, and I think he knows, or he knew from basically the moment he went out in qualifying, at that point your setup is locked in. From the moment he went out then, he was like, we got this slightly wrong, and I'm going to have to live with this for basically all of qualifying now, and then the whole of the race. And I think he was kicking himself a bit about that, of course, because he finished behind Lando as well. The other interesting factor in this season as it continues is it's who's got the fastest car. And then if we're saying McLaren with that, and actually McLaren kind of dispute that. They say that, yes, on certain circuits, it's very clear that they've got the fastest car. Stella mentioned Hungary and Barcelona, tracks like that. But he said in Azerbaijan, he didn't think it was the case, which makes you wonder, Ferrari, the last two races, Monza, Azerbaijan, very specific races, but two races where Ferrari have clearly made a step back towards competitiveness. And it's coincided with an upgrade that came in Italy. So, I mean, going into this weekend, which is always a hard one to call, Singapore, it always has anomalous results in the middle of a season. Where do you put that ranking of who's got the fastest car?
Yeah, I think exactly absolutely what you said there about the last two races being, slightly hard to pick out from the rest. I think Ferrari here, it wouldn't be a wild bet to say they're going to win again. Sainz won here last year. I think even I remember early in the season, we were talking to Carlos Sainz, and he said Singapore. I think it was Saudi. It wouldn't have been Saudi because he obviously wasn't racing, but it was at that kind of time of the year. He said, we know that Singapore we're going to be strong regardless of how developments go later in the year. So this has always been a place they're going to be strong. And I think what's fascinating, isn't it, is that in that Baku race, the race for victory between Piastri and Leclerc was basically a tyre battle. One of them cooked the tyres pretty early, but still went after the lead driver, and then Charles' tyres dropped off at the end. In Monza, it came down to Ferrari being able to do that one-stop strategy, and McLaren were adamant. To your point about them being adamant they're not the quickest car, they were adamant, weren't they, in Monza? They were like, we just simply couldn't have done what Charles Leclerc did in that as well. So that's quite fascinating to see as well, that you've got this, I think it's very finely balanced in terms of, I think they're very, very close together on pace. And now you're getting to a point of which car is the gentler on its tires at certain races and which drivers, are better at doing that. So yeah, I think, I mean, it's funny, isn't it, Ferrari, because you go through spells with them when covering them, and I'm sure their fan base feel the same when it's the opposite to Red Bull, right? A few months ago, we're like, oh, they've just got it wrong again. They've gone the wrong direction. And then suddenly they're right back up the front again. And you suddenly start to look at the constructors table and you think, well, McLaren should win this from here. But Ferrari are kind of, if McLaren have a bad weekend or two, Ferrari could be right up there as well, which is bonkers to say. But yeah, I think I would say I'm a bit more cautious longer term with Ferrari, because I think with McLaren since Miami, they have had that all round package, haven't they? Of we've been quick everywhere. For Ferrari, I think there's been Charles. I think has had two great races, and I think yeah, if he'd defended on the inside like Piastri defended on the inside from him later in that race, he probably would have won. He could have kept him behind him. So yeah, hard to say. But for this weekend, I think Ferrari will be good. But I think over the course of the rest of the season, I've still got to give it to McLaren just because of where they've been quick, how they've been quick everywhere. Ferrari, it's just kind of jumped back in, and the Ferrari fan of old in me wants to jump in and say the opposite, but I'm just tempering it with a bit of old school caution in that regard. But I could be wrong though. I mean, the thing we're seeing, aren't we, with this regulation? You're saying about teams losing their way a lot with regulations. What we are seeing is as well. There's such a narrow field now with the budget cap. I think if you get an upgrade right, it really makes a difference. It's not like the old days where it's like, oh, we've gained, the car performance is a lot better, the drivability is better. You're actually seeing a significant step up in terms of performance, and because the top four teams are pretty close together, if you gain a few tenths of a second a lap, you're jumping quite a way up the competitive order. So that could be in play as well.
Yeah, there's no more throwing money at the issue like there used to be, as you say. One last thing to touch on before we put a bow on Baku and talk about other things. The Sainz-Perez collision at the end of the race. I mean, what a way to finish. It felt like something was building up towards in that race. And of course...
It did, didn't it? It did.
I mean, simple question. Whose fault was it?
Well, we had a good conversation about this over a beer yesterday, didn't we? So I'll defer to you after I've said my bit. But I've got to say, my first take on it when I saw it was, I thought that's about 70-30 signs. That you've got the guy on the inside, seems to drift across. Perez obviously looking up ahead in the road, but you've made some very good points, which I'm going to let you share with the listeners to the pod as well. But I think that the steward's verdict, the more you look at it, the more I think. Yeah, we kind of live in this age now, don't we, where whenever there's a collision, people are like someone has to be to blame. And I think actually racing incidents, sometimes if you can't blame one driver predominantly, which is obviously what the wording of the regulation is, then you shouldn't do that. And I think that the steward's verdict suggests that both of them could have done something to affect the outcome in a different way, or at least there was mitigating circumstances for both. But I'm trying to steal some of what you said yesterday, and I think you said it better than I could. But my initial reaction was Sainz definitely over Perez.
Yeah, and that's understandable because Sainz does clearly move from
kind of like he drifts, doesn't he? Like
yeah. Because if you use the wall as the parallel on the line that you might expect him to be on, then he definitely moves slightly away from that to the left, which where Perez is. But the main thing that I felt kind of came out of reviewing it a little bit and then also looking at what the steward said was that they both wanted to get in Leclerc's slipstream. Leclerc was ahead of them as they exited the corner, and Leclerc wanted to break that slipstream. So Leclerc moves to the left, and as he does that, Sainz, and it's only marginal, and it's not really a big change compared to what a driver would usually do. They run right up to the wall, but then they do tend to move back towards the middle of the circuit. But perhaps Sainz did that a little bit more whilst chasing the Leclerc slipstream. Of course, Leclerc was moving into, directly in front of him. So he was about to gain from that slipstream. So had no desire whatsoever to move with Sainz. And then the collision happened. The only thing I would say is that Perez was the car behind, therefore better visibility of everything that was going on. I'm not saying Sainz wasn't aware that Perez was there because he clearly was. You saw him look at mirrors, and I think he said as much to the stewards. But I think that's the only thing where you might put a bit of blame towards Perez is that he was in a position where he could control what was going on, by seeing what was going on in front of him. And as soon as, Sainz was moving that way, Leclerc was moving to the left. He's been racing in this sport for such a long time. You would have thought he may also move to the left a bit. But for me, absolutely a racing incident. I don't have a problem with things being called a racing incident and not going through, all of these kind of
Yeah.
constant like lengthy steward inquiries. We still had one of those, but then not having, this kind of blame game at the end of it to sensibly say
And
these things happen when you're racing.
yeah, and I think that, yeah, you're right. The FIA get a lot of stick, don't they? But if they're going to look at stuff just to make sure, and then they're like, no, actually, neither one's to blame, then I think that's fair. I think as well, what was telling, obviously, if you go down the rabbit hole of F1 Twitter, it can be a bit depressing, but like you were seeing there was a lot of debate on Sunday night about it between, I suppose, Sainz fans and Perez fans. And it is striking, isn't it? Everything that happened there with them happened in, a couple of seconds. The decisions of, the line they're taking and the look up to Sainz and stuff like that. I think it's a bit like any sport really, but you can lose so much of what's happening. The more you watch a replay, you lose some of that, of that case of these guys are reacting to stuff happening ahead of them and they're kind of assuming this from this guy. I think you can suddenly start putting a lot more kind of like logic behind what's happening when really these are two racing drivers who, in the heat of the moment, can see the car ahead is struggling. It's probably there for the taking, and they're both going after him. I know to your point, they should know better than to do what they did, but you lose a bit of the kind of the racing instinct to it a bit. The more you analyze it, I think. So yeah, I think it was sensible.
So I was hoping that happened in Baku, the exciting race we had, the potential different winners, the change in the lead of the Constructors' Championship. It led our producer, Dave Presley, to ask us, is this one of the greatest F1 seasons in history? What do you think, Nate? I mean, is it up there? 2021 springs to my mind right up there, but of course we haven't had this one completely play out. We may get an Abu Dhabi decider.
Yeah. I think it's got to be. It's got to be in the conversation. And yeah, to your point, I mean, I think if this does go to the wire, then it will have to be. And I think the reason is 21's a great example to use, but that was kind of a conventional championship thriller, wasn't it? It was great. But you had two guys. It was a very easy story to tell. It was like they were close to each other all year. The wins went back and forth. They collided a couple of times. The teams were, Red Bull and Mercedes were kind of locked in this like crazy duel all year. We knew all year it was the two of them. And it was still great, but it was that kind of conventional, one driver versus the other. This one hasn't really followed any kind of narrative structure. You know that in 21, everyone, that annoying phrase by the end, it's like, well, you couldn't script this if you tried. It's like that's probably how you would have scripted a Formula One championship battle, isn't it? The two guys, it goes down to the final race, goes down to the final lap. They exchange wins, they collide a couple of times. There's been no convention to this whatsoever. Red Bull's been out in front, and all the conventional wisdom that we had was they're going to stay in front. They're going to be I remember me saying it, in I think Miami, ironically, when the whole season turned around. But it was like, oh, these days it's hard to turn around that kind of deficit so quickly. And McLaren have done that. Ferrari, to the point we were talking about earlier, have done that. Mercedes, we've barely talked about Mercedes, but they out of nowhere have suddenly come into being a winning team. I know that recently they've not had those wins again, but I think you've had so many things, and also not just the unpredictability of the championship. You've also had, what is it, 7 different winners. And I think there's been some really great feel-good moments in this season, regardless of who you support. So you had Sainz having appendicitis and then winning the race in Australia. Ollie Behrman's debut before that as well was great for Ferrari, young kid driving for the most famous team in racing. You had Charles Leclerc finally winning in Monaco, which I think everyone, regardless of who you support, thought that was great. Lewis winning in Silverstone, I think, was one of the highlights of the season. I think Piastri, kind of having that breakthrough win. And Hungary was a bit weird, wasn't it? Because of all the stuff with Lando, but then him like doubling that up in Baku. And then obviously Lando as well, finally getting that first win. I think it's easy to forget now that, coming into this year, I actually looked back a few days ago, and at the start of the season, I wrote one thing every driver needs to do this year. And for Lando, he's just got to win. Like this whole thing of him, the Lando no wins thing was huge. And the fact he's done that and he's kind of stepped into this role of a championship contender, I think it's great. And so, yeah, it's always hard to say the greatest, because I'm trying to remember. I remember 2012 being great. We had a bunch of different winners early on. I always loved the 2009 season because it's very similar to this one, when you had Brawn winning a bunch of races, and then Jenson Button didn't win again, did he? After kind of May onwards, and just kind of eked out the championship. And then Vettel and Red Bull, ironically, were in the opposite position, were kind of chasing it at the end. I always thought it was a pretty great season because it was hard to predict what was happening next, and I think we've got that with this one as well. So, yeah, I think for me, to try and think about it, especially the two we had before, if you think about what last year was like, just night and day's difference. So, ask me again in Abu Dhabi, and I'm sure if we're still talking about a championship fight, it'll have to overtake 21 even because there's just been so much to it that 21 didn't have.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think 21 had that really bitter rivalry. Not only
Yeah.
it was to the extent between Max and Lewis once they started having on-track collisions, but also between Toto and Christian. I feel like that rivalry was
Yes,
even
that's
more
true.
bitter than one on track, and that really added to it. I mean, that was such a narrative that you could build around, and we don't have that so much this year. But I'm not sure. Again, it's just a different style of championship, isn't it?
Yeah. What's out of everything? Sorry, I went down. I know we talked that we've got a rundown sheet that we follow, and I've basically just like ticked off every point in my answer. But out of all of those, I mean, what have been the standout points for you? Because I mean, we've attended most of the races together. It's really difficult when you go back through, and that's just talking about the wins and stuff. I think there's been a load of great things happening, further down as well. But just from the top points, what have been the standout moments for you that you think kind of set this apart from other seasons maybe that we've had?
I think for me, it's the general themes rather than the moments themselves. We have had some fantastic races. I mean, that Lewis victory in Silverstone, I think was pretty special for everyone there because it was a home victory. Of course, Charles had the same in Monaco and then in Monza, the two races that he wanted to win above all else. So when you think of those real like high point emotional moments, that they were there. Of course, the first wins, you've mentioned those already. But I'd say the theme of how Red Bull have gone from such a dominant position to where they are now and trying to unpickle that. I still don't fully get what's happened there. Of course, the simplistic way to look at it is, well, Adrian Newey left and then the car was not very good.
He took he I joked to you, didn't I, before that he took the magic pin out of the car in Miami that he puts in his cars, and now they don't know how to put it back in. They're like, oh, what? Wait, something's missing.
But it's obviously not as simple as that.
No.
And, there's clearly some stuff that was baked into this car probably from, 2022, 2023, that wasn't really exposed when they had such a big performance advantage. But because you've had McLaren put the pressure on them, Ferrari and Mercedes to some extent, or certainly at certain circuits, then they've had to really push this car to limits and they found the limitations and they just haven't been able to develop it. So I think getting your head around all of that, and then also the way that Max has then had to react to that. I feel like we've seen very different stages of Max coming to terms with that. In Austria, he was very frustrated. I mean, there was also just the mistake the team made in the pit stop, and at that time, I think I was certainly looking at it and still thinking, come on, Max, what are you worried about? You got such a big lead in the championship. This is never going to go wrong. But what he saw is the potential worst case scenario. And I think that's a real winner's mentality that he looked at what was going on there and he said, well, if this extrapolates far enough down the line, and he would have been far more aware of the kind of underlying issues they had even at that stage. And I think he was already worrying that the team wasn't doing enough to get themselves out of a hole that, they were just about to really drop into. And so, and then seeing how Max has kind of leveled himself off a bit around that, it really is just seeing a true champion kind of react to the way things are happening. And I think watching Max dominate for so long, he doesn't have to kind of really go to the depths in 2022 and 2023 that he did in 21, and he will do or is doing right now. And I think, that's when you get to see just how talented these drivers are, but also the psychological approach of these drivers. And so that's been great. And then also, arguably, and I think this has been overplayed, but Lando Norris and potentially, some of the weaknesses he has when, he's so overcritical, so public about his personal criticism. Now, perhaps that will work for him and, he will turn that criticism into better results. But at times, and it's certainly been leveled at him that it's not helping and that, he's kind of, almost creating a situation for himself where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because he's not being positive enough about it and all this kind of stuff. But I find that fascinating to watch. It adds another layer to just the results and teams winning, teams losing, and the ups and downs when you actually see how it impacts the drivers and their psychology towards the championship.
Yeah, and that mate, that Norris point is spot on. And I think as well that's becoming even more emphasized by Piastri. I mean, a few people have used, people were describing him as like, ice in his veins, cold-blooded, just, the way he approaches races. And when you talk to Piastri, he's very steely, isn't he? There's not much of that self-criticism. And actually, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Norris does that, and Charles Leclerc's quite like that as well. He often, if he makes a mistake, he'll come out and say, I made the worst mistake ever today. But and you do think, don't you? You think I would never hear Lewis say this or Max say this. And I think it's a really it's I think it's something to keep a watch on with those top guys, because I think Piastri and Norris, to use that phrase that the kids use, I'm probably going to butcher it, but they're kind of built differently in the sense of I think the way they deal with pressure is very different. And again, we don't know whether that's good or bad for Norris, but I think that it's starting to get into his head. He's squandered a lot of opportunities this year, and actually, I think this championship should be a lot closer than it is right now. I think that in the middle of the season, Norris dropped a bunch of points and to your point about Max realizing down the line, I think it's funny, isn't it, with Norris? It's kind of frustrating sometimes because you want to see that fire in his belly of him saying, I want to go for this championship. And he'll say, no, I've always been in the championship since race one, which, mathematically is obviously true. But you want to see him come out and put the flag down and say, no, if I don't win the championship, I'll be disappointed this year. And that kind of fire in him. And maybe that's not him, but it's telling. And I think we'd get a different reaction to this season if you'd flip them around. One other thing I think, and it adds to your point about Verstappen, and I think it's kind of documentary worthy given what we've seen already and probably where it's going, because we don't know if there's more people to leave. But I think what we're seeing, we're at the very beginning of the kind of the implosion of this Red Bull team, which as a narrative is dimmed a bit over the last couple of months. But obviously everything since the Christian Horner scandal at the start of the year, the power dynamics in that team. I mean, you and I both know, people within the Red Bull team and within the circle of people that would know what's going on. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that there's so many levers being pulled by different people. And I think it's wrong to just say it all happened after Horner, the Horner investigation. I think this is a byproduct of the passing of Dietrich Mateschitz. Left that power vacuum at the top of Red Bull. A lot of people now looking at the racing team. You've got people on the Austrian side, you've got people on the Thai side, you've got other interests in there as well. And it's like, what is the future of that team? And you've seen Nui's left. Obviously, Wheatley's found a better opportunity somewhere to advance up. And in all of that, there's the uncertainty around Max as well that's come out of that. And the fact that we still don't know for sure. We know Max is driving for Red Bull next season. We don't know for sure what he's doing in 2026. Suggests, doesn't it, that Verstappen is keeping that foot in the door. You said about him looking down the road at the worst case scenario. I think his foot is well and truly in that door to say, if I need to get out of here, I'm going to leave at the first opportunity I have. And imagine predicting that even 12 months ago at the start of the season. It would have been, you would have said, why on earth would Max Verstappen leave this team? You'd think at the start of the season, you'd have said Max is going to win this year and he'll win 25, probably. Now, if you said he's not going to win either of those to me, I'd say, yeah, okay, I could believe it. I still think he'll win this year, just because it's Max Verstappen, and I think that he'll do enough, what he needs to do. But it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And so the fact that door is open and that narrative has opened up this year, and again, that kind of stems from Jos Verstappen and Christian Horner falling out as well. There's that whole narrative there. Verstappen it's kind of this weird situation we see, isn't it, Laurence, where Verstappen does not like to talk about any of that stuff in the public. He'll give little answers and we try and pick them apart on what he means, but he just does not talk about it. And I think he is just the guy who likes to turn up. It's a cliche, right? But he likes to turn up, drive his car, and then just say to Jos Verstappen and his manager Raymond, you guys deal with all that nonsense in the background. I'm going off to play FIFA, or it's not called FIFA anymore. It's called FC, isn't it? Or to go racing. And as much as people joke about his gaming, I think that is a release from what is happening around Red Bull, because yeah, the whole situation there. And even when you look at the situation with Perez and Ricciardo and Lawson, there's just something at Red Bull that it just isn't, I don't know, it's just not right. It doesn't compute in a logical sense. So that's been just fascinating to see. And I think it's going to keep unwinding and unraveling into next year as well, which obviously comes potentially at the detriment of their chances of doing something next year. And obviously then there's the implications beyond that, because if Max is gone, suddenly that's just a completely different team without Max at the helm. I mean, you can take Nui away, but taking a driver like this is so difficult to replicate a guy like Verstappen. Obviously, Nui is as well, but you've got a team of engineers there. You only have one. You only have two drivers. If your superstar leaves one seat, you can't just go and find another one off the street. It's very difficult to do that.
Yeah, and imagine if Max doesn't get this title this year as well. I mean, it still seems fairly far-fetched given the points difference, but it's possible. And, we talked about how much Red Bull has struggled. Like, what would that do to that whole situation? How much quicker do you think that would make it unravel if Max doesn't even get the 24 championship, remains a 3-time world champion, Lando Norris all of a sudden a 1-time world champion. And yeah, for Max and his whole feeling around the team. Also, the team itself. I mean, I don't think they're going to win the constructors. You know, that already
Yeah,
seems
that's
to
got
be
long gone.
McLaren's to
Yeah.
lose. So you know, what would it do to that team in terms of, because it feels like perhaps it's still salvageable from this point. You know, there's still lots of very clever people there. There's still that great facility in Milton Keynes. You know, all of the ingredients are roughly there, but it just feels like they're lacking that bit of direction. I feel like if they lose that title as well, then it
Yeah,
really
it's
does
huge.
start to unravel.
Well,
Well,
especially with Nui gone as well. I think there's so much pressure on that technical department to get that right now. You know,
yeah.
and I think it's not just been Nui, has it? Like let's be clear on that. Like, you know, there has been a team of people working there, but they've been working under his direction. And suddenly he goes. And I think there's a lot of people still at the Red Bull team who are quite bitter about the fact that whenever Red Bull produce a winning car, everyone's like, oh, Adrian Nui, what a genius. You know, it's like it's just him. You know, but now that team is under pressure. It's like, okay, well, Nui's gone now. You guys have to, and you guys are under pressure. You know, our rivals are catching us up. You guys now have to prove you can do it without him. So, yeah, loads of things going on. And I hadn't thought about that, what it would mean for Max without the championship. But you're right. I think that would be, I mean, again, we're getting into the weeds of potentially an end of season podcast here. But if Max does leave Red Bull and goes to Mercedes, that obviously has a huge impact there because you would assume Russell's the guy who leaves and and it's all of these scenarios that you wouldn't have even thought possible, start of the season.
Well, our first step towards finding out who does win this championship is Singapore this weekend. It's a pretty unusual circuit in that it's a street circuit at night. I mean, I remember when this one first came on the calendar in 2008, people were just minds blown over this because, you know, we'd had Monaco's and various different street circuits in Formula One, but this one's a little bit special. It's a little bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's my first time here, obviously. So for me, I'm kind of a bit wide-eyed looking at all of it. And we ended up, didn't we, yesterday, opposite the famous Raffles that does the Singapore Sling. So I think we're going to try and that might be the only time to see what that place is like tonight. But yeah, I mean, I've only ever seen this, and I've always wanted to cover it from a journalistic point of view. And I think that is the thing, is that this kind of changed the game in terms of what people expect from a street race now. You know, you look at a lot of the races that come on the calendar now, especially Vegas. You know, Vegas, the line from Monaco to Vegas is kind of hard to draw if you don't have the Singapore Grand Prix kind of, you know, making its debut when it did, because that visual spectacle of cars under the lights is one of the reasons why, you know, teams like to, you know, we're seeing a few new liveries this weekend and stuff like that. They just look spectacular under the lights. And yeah, I think every driver lists this as one of their favorite races, don't they? So whenever that is the case, you know, it's something special.
Yeah, and a weird one to cover because I mean we're recording this podcast now at 10:15 in the evening, and we're
Mm.
about to kind of go out for a late lunch, early dinner because we work with a time zone that's kind of 7 hours out
We're,
of whack. You actually pretty
yeah.
much stay on European time when you're here, which means going to bed sometimes at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and not waking up till midday, 1 p.m., even 2
Yeah, I
p.m.
woke
You
up
can
at
get
two. I woke
equivalent.
up at 2 p.m. this morning, and for a second, I was like, I've overslept something, and then I thought, no, I haven't. It's it's middle of the night everywhere else in the world. So
Yeah, and yeah, it is a weird vibe, but I think everyone kind of likes it. And of course, we're getting used to it because Saudi Arabia is kind of similar, and as you say, Vegas is even more extreme in terms of the way they run that race. What one point to note this weekend, a fourth DRS zone has been added. Now we don't usually talk about DRS zones and all that kind of stuff on this podcast, but I think it is significant because it's on that straight that didn't exist until last year. So it's now
mm.
between what they call turns 14 and 16. There's a little kink in it, which is turn 15, but it's where there used to be a little stadium section in front of the bay, and the cars would go around. This actually where Nelson Piquet famously crashed,
Yes,
Nelson Piquet
yeah,
Jr. To help Alonso onto victory in 2008. I think that could really improve race because I think even last year we didn't have that DRS zone there, but we did have that straight there. I think even last year that improved the racing round here. So DRS zone should only add to that, don't you think?
yeah, I think so. And you think last year we had that situation, didn't we, where we had Sainz? Was it Sainz, Russell, and Norris, or Sainz, Norris, and Russell, and they were all so close together? You know, obviously, Sainz was playing that game quite strategically last year in terms of trying to keep trying to keep Norris. I forget what he exactly what it was now. He was keeping Norris within his DRS so that Norris could keep Russell behind him, which was really
That's
smart
right.
as it played out. But you throw in another one of those, and it's just another chance for people to get by. And I think Baku again, it proved, didn't it, with these cars that what we're seeing is because the teams are close together, they just need that slight point of difference that DRS gives them, and they can overtake. And I know that some people don't like DRS, and it used to suck when it was like cars just like I hate it in Spain. In Spain, it looks ridiculous because you just have cars whizzing past each other. But I think in some circuits, you know, especially some of the lowest, the lowest speed street circuits, especially like when you need that extra bit, I think it will really bunch people together. So yeah, I'm all for it. And yeah, I think you're right. I remember last year coming away from the racing, and that was a really good Singapore Grand Prix, and then remembering that they'd done that tweak to it, and I thought, I wonder how much of that actually made that spectacle what it was. I'm not sure it was the whole thing, but yeah, I think it was a good ingredient to that.
Yeah, I mean, low speed corners, there's enough of them anyway. I think there's still 20 odd around this circuit. So, you know, the low speed corners, they do tend to kind of like create gaps and obviously difficulties to overtake. You know, you need a straight with these modern F1 cars and ideally DRS to get alongside. So anyway, I think it's going to be good. Now, we've talked about how close the field is going into this weekend. So we'd usually say who you're going to pick and whatever. I'm not going to do the analysis stuff. I'm going to go straight into predictions and get you to your top three. And from there, we can talk about why you think whoever maybe on the top three is on the top three or will be on the top three.
Sure. So I'll do it in reverse order because we've made that. Well, I made that a thing, I think, once by doing it because I was stalling for time one time. I'm going to say third, Lando Norris, second, Oscar Piastri, and first, Charles Leclerc.
Wow, yeah, that's very. I think we all had those three in our Baku predictions as well, and obviously
we did, yeah, and we all had them jumbled around. I think those three guys are just in form, aren't they, at the moment? And but yeah, I'll explain the Piastri over Lando, but I'll let you. No, you might think the same thing.
Explain away. Because obviously, if team orders were there, then it would be.
Well, yeah, and I think actually in that situation that they would probably move them over, but you don't know, right? They could, it could be a late. I'm still not convinced McLaren are going to say to Oscar move over and let Lando through. They might do in that situation now, and maybe I can get half a point if that is the order until like the final lap or something. They switch around. But if you actually take a look at the last 10 races, no one has scored more points than Oscar Piastri. And if you look at every race since Hungary, the only time Lando's finished ahead of him was Zandvoort when Lando won the race. So it is actually a big talking point still, this team orders thing, because Piastri is the guy who is likely to get ahead of Norris in these races. He's not qualifying better. Their qualifying record is mad. I think it's off the top of my head, it's Lando is 14-3 up in Grand Prix, and yet in the races, Piastri seems to be coming into his own a bit more. So really, again, just kind of mad how different the two things are. But yeah, I think on race pace, I can see Piastri kind of being ahead of McLaren, and then now you're making me doubt my prediction because I think in that situation they probably would move them over. But I'm going to stick to it. I said it. I'll stick to it now. That will be nice and dramatic. Piastri refusing to move over for his teammate. We'll go with that.
Yeah, it could be. Okay, I'm going to go with George Russell in third, just to mix it up. I feel like you got Podium in Baku, kind of lucky, but I feel like Mercedes might be a bit quick around here. Then Oscar Piastri in second, and then Lando Norris in first.
Nice.
So I think you're right to include Ferrari in the conversation here. I think they're going to be quick, but I also think, might be okay. And also like Red Bull. I mean, neither of us have put Max Verstappen in our top three, which is crazy.
I can't believe the last time we did that.
Whereas it used to be the case when we first started doing this prediction game, we almost didn't bother saying who would be first because it was going to be Max Verstappen.
Yeah, no, it's mad how it's turned around. Yeah, I think that's probably a much safer bet. I'm kind of just throwing darts now at this point and just saying I think this will happen. But yeah, certainly McLaren should be super strong. So I think the fact that we've both put two McLarens on the podium makes sense. And I know Katie's not here, but I did just want to give one shout out, and I think it's something that I actually made us miss on our run through. But I think another great part of this season, just to put a bow on that conversation, we're seeing an emerging of talent, aren't we, in Formula One at the moment in terms of rookie drivers and stuff. How good was it to see Colapinto get those points in Baku? I thought it was such a good story. I don't know if you saw his Instagram message. Lewis put a message up just saying, tough race, but great to see Colapinto get points. Great to see Behrman get points. And Colapinto put afterwards, he said, I can't remember exactly the words, but he wrote this message after saying, Lewis, you coming to see me after the race was one of the highlights of my career so far. I thought it was so cool seeing great, one of the all-time greats with Lewis, and he's still racing against people that feel that way about him. I just thought was really cool. And the fact we're seeing Colapinto, Behrman, obviously Behrman's got a seat for next season. It's I think Formula One's in such a good place with all these young guys coming through. So really nice to see. Unless you're Logan Sargent, that must have been a pretty bitter pill to actually swallow watching that, seeing the car get points, but kind of vindicates the Williams decision, doesn't it, to move on from him?
Yeah, I think Sargent's unlucky as well in that the big update that came to the car was at his final race, and of course he left a lot of that update over the track when he crashed in qualifying. But
savage, but he did. That's true.
He did. True. And that was certainly part of it, and that was part of the thinking in that they're working super hard to get this car competitive, and then if it gets crashed and it's no good. And of course, Colapinto did have an accident in FP1, I think it was in Baku, but still came back and got that result, and it was hugely impressive. It's not just about the car to be able to do that. And when it was us two doing the podcast when the Colapinto announcement came, I think the minute we logged on to start recording, and we really weren't sure about him. And the one thing we said is that he doesn't have a seat for next year. We know that already. But if he can prove himself, if he can just put together some solid results, then he could become a contender, even if he misses out 25 for 26. And okay, he's only 2 races in, but so far he's doing absolutely everything right. And if that Williams does kind of, has taken a genuine step up in competitiveness, certainly at circuits, and he can capitalize on it, get the points when they're there, then that's going to be huge. And it is going to put him in the driver market, not for next year, because pretty much everything is sealed up, apart from that one Sauber seat that he's not really been linked to. But I reckon 26, it could put him in the mix, and that'd be great to see as well. So, well, we should get off to our dinner somewhere in Singapore.
We should.
It is getting late. And we will be back next week for more Unwrapped then.